right, so welcome everyone. On behalf of the Ontario Cooperative Association, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Co-ops for Creatives. So I'm your host, Michelle Chrisman, and I'm the Education Manager at the Ontario Cooperative Association. And joining us for some additional support is our awesome new co-op placement student, David Adeyemi from Seneca Polytechnic. So David will be here. If you have any tech needs, you can find him in the chat and message him. So I'm thrilled to have all of you here with us today. And I can't wait to hear from our special guests, Eileen Mary Holowka and Jennie Robinson Faber. They're co-executive directors of Baby Ghosts, a nonprofit supporting worker-owned and worker-centric game studios across Canada through grants, mentorship, and open tools. So I was going to say I'm a bit of a co-op nerd, but I'm actually a huge co-op nerd. And so when I hear about people like Jennie and Eileen who are using cooperative ideals and values to build community and capacity in creative industries like game design, I get pretty excited about it. What they're doing is exactly how we show people how to move from an extractive and exploitive economy to one that's more sustainable and more human-centered. And we're so grateful for the chance to share the work of Baby Ghosts that do so much to educate folks about working more cooperatively and empowering people to create workplaces that feel better, where those doing the work have ownership and voice. Co-ops can help teach us in a really practical way about the power and the importance of democracy, and also the importance of fostering community, which is more important than ever in these tumultuous times. We acknowledge that the land where I join you from today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee. This territory is covered by the Williams and Upper Canada Treaties. Let us take a moment to recognize and reflect the deep connections Indigenous peoples have to this land and acknowledge our responsibility to work towards reconciliation and justice in all aspects of care and community building. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Please welcome Eileen Mary Holowka, PhD, they, she, is a queer and disabled white settler living on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. They are a writer, game developer, and community organizer, advocate, with a background in theater, games, poetry, and health communications. They have a PhD in communication studies from Concordia University and have published extensively within and outside of academia. They are co-founder of both Weird Ghosts and Baby Ghosts with Jennie Robinson Faber, as well as a member of Gamma Space Collaborative Studio. They also work as the general manager of Infinite Ammo. Jennie Robinson Faber, her, she, is a queer white settler community arts advocate and organizer, software developer, and leader in the interactive digital media industry for over 15 years. She co-founded the video game arts nonprofits DMG Toronto and Gamma Space Collaborative Studio in 2012. In 2015, she joined the board of the Toronto Media Arts Centre and became its operations director in 2017. She served on a number of arts and industry-related boards with Ontario Creates, Museum of Contemporary Art Toronto, and the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television, among others. She co-chaired the 2016 edition of Indiecade, presented at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City. I'll now stop sharing my screen. I've thrown my phone out the door, so that won't disturb us again. And I'm going to hand it over to Eileen and Jennie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, for inviting us and also for the introduction, which I think really speaks to what we're presenting today. In fact, I'll just cut I'll cut my first slides out. You've said it already. Um, yeah, no, it's so nice to be here. It's nice to see familiar faces in the crowd and also new folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. Um, as Michelle mentioned, Jenny and I have been supporting video game studios in becoming cooperatives over the last 5 years. And today we're excited to share what we've learned from that and also how it can be applied to other creative industries other than just games. As creative people, we know how valuable collaborative work can be. We love sharing ideas and iterating together, building on each other's strengths. These are the things that we want, but the structures that we work under often do not support this collaboration. Even within the creative industry, structures often impose binary hierarchies: the boss, the worker, the owner, the employee, rigid roles that don't flex with project needs, extraction of profit that doesn't flow to contributors, and decision-making power that's concentrated at the top. And some of you may recognize this background from the game Peak, which is a collaborative game. If you don't help each other out, things are going to look grim. You may have heard some of these phrases throughout your time working in creative industries, whether it's the tech industry or video games or film or TV or nonprofits. The move fast and break things, like let's break the way of doing things. This often translates to breaking people and then replacing them when they burn out. You might have heard the phrase, we're a family here, which sounds reassuring, but that's only until the layoffs come if it's a employee employer situation. You might have heard that crunch is just the way that it is, which is really translates to your health being acceptable collateral in that business. Or the boss decides, which translates to your voice not really mattering. The industries that we work in often operate on a logic that treats people and workers as disposable. Many of us have experienced these negatives of hierarchical structures and we don't want to replicate them. But what is the alternative, and how do we know where to begin without a good roadmap? Well, that's why we're here today. We're going to show you that there is another way, one that's been working since pre-colonial and pre-contact times in other industries, and that we've been adapting specifically for creative work. So we have about 30-40 minutes of us talking before Q&A. We'll try and leave a good amount of space for Q&A. But we'll also answer questions after the fact. So here's what we're going to chat about. We'll start with why this moment matters, what is happening in the creative industries that make worker co-ops not just nice, but necessary. Then we'll get into what makes creative co-ops different from both traditional co-ops and traditional studios. This model isn't the same as the one that we know for like agricultural co-ops or retail co-ops. And then we'll try and spend the bulk of time on how this actually works in practice, so how you make decisions, handle pay, deal with IP, and protect a sustainable pace. And we'll talk about some of the pitfalls that we've seen that take down co-ops and collaborative studios so that you can hopefully avoid them in your own journey. We'll show you a case study from a studio that we've worked with, Amalor, who have been operating as a creative co-op for 5 years. And then we'll end with where to start. So if you're champing at the bit. And hint, it's not immediately filing incorporation paperwork. So to move right along, let's start with why. So who the heck are we? We've been introduced a little bit, so I won't spend too much time on this. We are Canada's only organization focused specifically on cooperative game studio development. Our mission is to advance cooperative and worker-centric labor models in Canadian interactive digital arts sector through support, research, and community building. So we mainly work with underrepresented creators, meaning folks who have faced systemic barriers to getting into the games industry, because these are the people most often left behind and the people most often looking for alternatives. Our focus isn't to teach people how to make games. There are a lot of programs and tutorials for that. It's on helping them build sustainable worker-led structures And we've been doing this for a while. We've been running our peer accelerators since 2021, and we officially became a nonprofit in 2023. So here's a bit of what we've accomplished in that time. We've supported 27 studios across Canada, not just in Toronto and Vancouver, which are the usual hubs of this kind of thing. Are the majority of our participants are IBPOC and gender marginalized, and we've deployed over $500,000 directly to creators as grants. But we don't just offer grants, we also offer peer support, workshops, and community, because those are the things that help sustain this sort of cooperative space. Alongside that, we've been contributing to research and building a network where co-ops can support other co-ops, as I mentioned, because we're all better off when we share resources, which is why we're here today. And this is just a photo of me and some of our peer accelerator teams at GDX in Edmonton last year. So before we get into how co-ops work, let's talk about why co-ops and why now, which some of you might already be on top of. It's timely. This is not just because 2025 was the year of cooperatives. It's so much more. The conditions in creative industries right now are pushing people towards alternatives, whether they know it or not. People are fed up, burned out, and they're looking for something different. And that creates an opening for models like ours. Many of you, I think, know this, that it's rough out there. These industries that we've been a part of have been operating in unsustainable, inequitable, and inhospitable ways for a long time. So it's no surprise that we're in this crisis moment. Our community members are fleeing traumatizing workplaces or even leaving these industries entirely because they have become unmanageable for them. In the games industry, we've seen this with mass layoffs and studio closures and precarity, despite the industry making billions of dollars. We've seen unionization efforts being responded to with studio shutdowns, as we most recently saw with Ubisoft Halifax. There's been massive layoffs as well in animation and VFX, and in arts and culture in general, there are brutal funding cuts, a reliance on the gig economy, and an epidemic of burnout. So displaced workers are actively seeking alternatives, and they're looking outside of the typical structures of capitalism that we have been told to expect. So despite what the meme says, this is not fine. The traditional structures have done a very poor job at keeping things equitable. So 74% of workers say that there's not equal treatment and opportunity for all in the games industry. But this isn't just unique to games, of course. We see it in animation, film, theater, and music. We've inherited these systematically disadvantaged structures that systematically disadvantage certain people. I really struggled on that one. Traditional studios are throwing workers overboard like ballast to keep the bosses afloat. So they're the heavy material the extra weight that they need to throw off board ends up being the workers. We saw this across the industry in 2023 to 2025, record profits alongside mass layoffs. But when you're an owner, you cannot be thrown off in the same way, which is what we're getting to. Of course, we're also familiar with this current moment with the push for AI. This is not to help workers, but to replace them or devalue their labor, to literally steal their labor for the lowering of the company's own expenses. And again, this has led artists to look for alternatives. With all this under consideration, I think this makes sense. The creative industry's logic is failing on its own terms. Businesses that moved fast are shuttering. Workers who gave everything to the family got thrown overboard. This system is built on urgency and hierarchy and extraction, and so of course it is collapsing. And this is grim, but it comes with an opportunity. There's a growing interest in worker-centric models, including from displaced workers. Funding bodies are increasingly supporting social enterprises, and co-op infrastructure already exists, so we don't need to recreate the whale. We just have to apply this to creative industries. And that's what we're going to introduce you to today. I know I've sort of prefaced this a few times, but we're gonna get there in a second. For the record, we know that it can feel really jarring to make this mental switch to cooperatives. It's not necessarily as big as it seems. Many of us already know these skills. We've been practicing them our whole lives in mutual aid networks, in community care, in keeping each other alive when institutions fail us. What we have to do now is formalize that knowledge that we already have into structures that can sustain us. And so, to start off that conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Jennie to talk about what makes creative co ops unique from other cooperative structures that we might be more familiar with.
Yeah, so what actually makes creative co-ops different? Um, Creative co-ops aren't just regular co-ops, but for games, animation, and art. They're also not just nicer or more ethical studios. They sit at that intersection that requires addressing those unsustainable practices in both directions. So traditional co-ops like agricultural, retail, housing don't deal with the logistics of creative production. And traditional studios have structures that are designed to extract value, not share it. So I want to take you through 5 things that make co-ops distinct from both. The first thing that makes creative co-ops unique is that the work itself is fundamentally different from traditional co-op sectors. Creative projects have those natural endpoints. You ship the game, you finish your album, you release the film, and this is just different from those traditional co-ops where operations are continuous. So this means that teams often expand and contract based on those project needs. You might need 5 people during production and 2 during pre-production. Traditional co-ops like agricultural or retail have those steady daily operations. So your structure needs to account for variability. Creative co-ops have memberships, they have compensation and planning challenges that most co-op resources don't address. The second unique factor is intellectual property or IP. Creative work produces code, art, music, design. All these things are intellectual property. And in a collaborative group, figuring out who owns what gets complicated really fast. This matters because credit and attribution are how creative workers build their careers. Your portfolio, your credits, your reputation, those are the things that get you your next job or your next opportunity. Traditional co-ops, on the other hand, deal with physical goods, produce, products, housing, things you make and sell that are concrete. Creative co-ops deal with ideas, and ideas are slippery. Who owns a character that 3 people worked on? What happens to someone's music if they leave the co-op? These questions don't have obvious answers, which is why having clear written agreements up front is so critical. And we'll get into the specifics of that later. This table shows the fundamental difference between industry logic and cooperative logic. Eileen mentioned in the industry, crunch is just how it works. In a co-op, you can write your own policies and say that's just not how we're going to operate. Industry logic says that deadlines justify any costs. But in our co-ops, we can just collectively decide to miss deadlines if they're not crucial. We get to weigh those trade-offs together. The industry treats urgency as a default mode. Everything is on fire at all times. In cooperatives, we reserve urgency for what actually matters, supporting our members when they're struggling. And perhaps most importantly, the industry treats our bodies like machines that should produce consistently. But bodies aren't machines, we're humans. Some weeks we have 60% to give, and other weeks we have 20% to give. And as Anne Malor puts it, when people aren't exhausted and terrified, they make better games. And this applies across creative industries. Rested and supported people do better work. In creative work, there's always that tension between creative vision and profit. The industry pushes you to take any project that pays. But in a co-op, we can write our values. into our governance so that they actually guide our operational decisions, not just hang on a wall somewhere or get posted on our website. Emelor is a really great example of this. They were offered a crypto project, which, at the time was good money, but they said no because it didn't align with their values. They discussed it as a group, decided together, and turned it down. That's only possible when you have structures that support values-based decision-making. In a traditional studio, the boss might take that project regardless of what the team thinks. And in a co-op, everyone has a voice in those decisions. The values that aren't tied to concrete practices are just nice words. The question is, does your structure actually let you act on your values? The fifth unique aspect is how creative co-ops approach revenue. Traditional studios often bet everything on one project. They raise money, they make the thing, and if it doesn't hit, they're done. The studio collapses, everyone goes their own ways. And we've seen this play out over and over. Studios that ship one game that fails commercially, and then they have to lay everyone off. Creative co-ops can build in diversification from the start. They can mix contract work or services with their original creative projects, adding grants, and find other income streams like speaking gigs or teaching or consulting. Amalor, who we're going to talk about even more later, has a breakdown of roughly 40% services, 35% game sales, 20% of the revenue, and 5% grants. So they don't have a single point of failure. If game sales are slow, the contract work can carry them. If the contracts dry up, there's passive income from their back catalog. And it doesn't mean that they're not committed to their creative vision. Rather, they are building a foundation that is stable enough that they can actually pursue that vision sustainably. So this is the fundamental inversion. Traditional studios cut people to protect margins. Co-ops cut hours to protect people. When revenue drops at a co-op, the first question isn't who do we fire? It's can we all work a bit less until things recover? And this is resilience. This is how you keep institutional knowledge and you keep trust. So let's get into the mechanics with Eileen. Eileen?
Thank you. So, yeah, let's talk about how creative co ops work. This background is from the game Atoll, an award winning surrealist documentary game in which you explore beautiful, dreamlike landscapes inspired by the topography and wildlife of the Atoll River Valley in Argentina. And it was made by an Argentinian game cooperative, which I think is cool. So let's start by talking about decisions. Not everything in a cooperative has to be a full consensus. You get to decide how decisions are made, by whom, and at what times, and through what procedures based on what makes sense for your organization. Cooperative decision-making, again, allows us to step back from industry logic, and we're going to keep sort of making those comparisons throughout this presentation. So whereas the industry, the boss would decide everything, in cooperatives you can have multiple decision-making tools applied where it fits. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Instead of that moving fast and breaking things, you can have the patience for the pace of trust, which we'll explain in a moment. Instead of the loudest voice winning, you can rotate who speaks, who facilitates, and who decides. I really can't overemphasize the power of role rotation. It's a great way to have people learn new skills and to make sure that you don't have that central sort of voice that takes over a space. And instead of decisions happening behind closed doors, everything is transparent. I was talking about having different sort of modes of making decisions, and for example, you can create a decision tree to delineate what kinds of decisions are made when and by whom. We also recommend to never vote when you're just 3 people, because this always creates a permanent tiebreaker where one person sort of becomes the unofficial boss. And while this might look complicated, it isn't necessarily slower. It's actually faster because you don't have people undermining decisions that they never agreed to. So let's just walk through this for a second. Oh, Jenny, if you could go back. Thank you. So maybe for day-to-day client issues, you have a rotating individual who takes those up, and you trust the person who's doing that work to make those decisions. For technical and creative choices, you might apply a relevant expert in that area, so the programmer making programming decisions, but that's something that you delegate. Then there's some decisions that you're going to want to make as a full group, like bringing on a new member or changing a direction of the co-op. Those are areas where it's great to have full consensus. Okay, we can move on to the next factor, which is what compensation can look like in a creative co-op. So co-ops don't magically make equity real. You don't just call yourself that and then everything's daisies and sunshine. The processes and technologies that we build are what make that happen. And that's why we spend so much time on governance design. This is also really up to the cooperative and what you want to do. Things are a conversation. Some divide compensation based on expertise. Some pay a flat salary across the board. Some pay members more based on their needs. This involves a foundation of open conversation about an often awkward or uncomfortable topic, and trust, as well as transparent criteria and periodic recalibration. Amalor, a team who went through Baby Ghost that we've talked about and we'll talk about more, uses needs-based compensation. So they say if someone has a disability flare or medical expenses, they might take more at that time. Those with family support or savings can afford to wait for compensation. This type of compensation recognizes that equality isn't the same as equity. It's everyone getting what they need to thrive. Aorta, which is a worker-owned cooperative of facilitators, coaches, and consultants, also structures this in an interesting way. They offer base pay for everyone and then have extra stipends for specific responsibilities, such as being on a personnel committee, holding an anchor client with financial responsibility, or holding down an anchor program. So that's one other alternative that you can consider. They also mentioned in one of their presentations that if no one wants to sign up for a job that you need doing, that might be a sign that that position needs higher pay. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that link. Let's once again consider these differences in compensation between industry and cooperatives. So in traditional studios, your pay depends on how well you negotiate. It rewards confidence, and it penalizes people who haven't been taught to advocate for themselves, which of course is often the most marginalized. Whereas in a co-op, criteria is transparent. Everyone knows how decisions get made. In the industry, information asymmetry benefits employers, whereas in a cooperative, transparency reduces anxiety and builds trust. The idea of what you're worth is a fiction that benefits employers, whereas skill levels set collaboratively mean that the group decides together what experience and contribution actually look like. And instead of equal pay equaling fairness, we have pay equity, not being the same thing as pay equality. And this brings us to one of the trickiest areas for creative co-ops, which Jenny had mentioned, which is IP and attribution. This is a space where a lot of collaborative projects run into trouble because people make assumptions instead of having explicit conversations up front. The legal default in Canada, and really most places, is that whoever creates intellectual property owns it unless the contract says otherwise. And if you're collaborating without agreements in place, you could end up in a very messy situation. So creative co-ops can handle this by having all the IP belong with the cooperative. It's a shared thing, just like the business itself. If a member leaves, the co-op retains all the assets. And this involves just, again, having really clear agreements about credit and attribution, because in these industries, those things can be critical for career building. It's really important to consider balancing collective ownership with individual recognition, so not erasing the contributions that people are making. It's important to have clear agreements about royalty structures, if that's applicable, and to talk about what happens to work in progress projects if someone leaves. Always better to have these conversations up front. This is a tension that traditional cooperatives do not have in the same way that creative cooperatives do, and these conversations are important to have right at the beginning. So we've talked about the structural stuff, decisions, pay, and IP, but let's also talk about pace, because this is a huge factor that can hurt creative workers. How fast are you expected to work? What happens when you can't keep up? And this is where the creative industries have caused enormous harm. There's an expectation of constant crunch, of sacrificing your mental and physical health for the project, of treating exhaustion as a badge of honor, and overdoing it as a badge of honor. So cooperatives give us the opportunity to do this completely differently. In many creative industries, crunch is normalized. We've talked about this. But crunch isn't a mystery. It's not an accident. It's a choice studios make because they've externalized the cost of poor planning onto workers' bodies. Burnout is an epidemic across creative industries, and the standard response is a shrug of, that's just how it works. But co-ops can do this differently. And it's funny, actually, that this image here of this Kotaku article is more than 10 years old. So this is a problem that has been deeply written into our world. How do cooperatives actually do things differently when it comes to pace? So Amalur, as we talked about, they've been operating for 5 years with zero crunch in an industry where crunch is treated as inevitable. They do 4-day work weeks, they have unlimited sick time, and have an anti-crunch written directly into their policies. Aorta, who we also mentioned, they have something called Dream Weeks. So every quarter they have a full week blocked out from external work for internal reflection, planning, and rest, which I also think is a really cool idea. In a co-op, different contribution levels should be normalized. Some weeks you give 35 hours, some weeks you give 15. Jennie and I are great at doing this as well. Capitalism's binary of productive and unproductive sort of space really sucks. Bodies aren't machines. Some weeks we have more capacity, some weeks we have less, and we need to plan around that instead of pretending that everyone can perform at 110% all the time, or that we're going to magically work exactly from 9 to 5 and then like only be productive in those hours, only stop outside of those hours, when that might look really different for different people. So to dig into this case study a little bit more, we've talked a lot about Amalur. I'm going to pass it back to Jennie to elaborate on that.
So I'll tell you about Amalur. They went through the 3rd cohort of our program, and it's not that they're perfect because no business is, but they've been operating successfully for 5 years. And these background images are from some of their games and creative projects. They're based in Montreal and Boston, and they reorganized as a worker co-op in 2023. Before that, they were an informal collective, so they had had some time to build that trust and test their working relationships before formalizing. And again, they've been doing this for 5 years now with no crunch, which this industry treats as inevitable. So I want to look really quickly at what they did differently. They rejected the entire industry logic that makes that crunch feel inevitable. The industry says, take any project for cash flow. Amalur rejects projects that don't align with their values. They have said no to well-paying work. And where the industry sees service work as failure, like you're only doing contract work because your real game isn't making money, Amalur treats service work as an intentional strategy. Here's what it looks like when values are actually operationalized, meaning tied to concrete practices. Amalur's stated value is anti-capitalism, make co-ops the default for games. That probably sounds nice to most of us here, but what does that actually mean in practice? It means every team member gets paid hours to do community building. It means they reject projects that don't align with their values. It means their pricing and tools reflect co-op values. They're not undercutting other workers or using exploitative platforms. The point is, values that aren't tied to concrete practices are just words. Anyone can say they care about sustainability and equity, but if your structure doesn't enforce those values, it's not actually happening. Service work. Most indie studios do contract work out of desperation. We need money now. Sometimes there's some embarrassment about it, like you're only doing it again because your real project isn't working. But Amalur flipped this again and said, what can we do to build our reputation, use our skills, and fund our games? So some lessons from Amalur I want to share are, existing revenue changes everything. It gives you stress-free time to think strategically, that ability to say no to bad projects. Looking at service work as a strategy rather than a failure, it funds your real work. It builds industry relationships, and it's paid time to practice your skills. Different capacities are normal. Plan around it. Operationalize your values. So now let's talk about where to actually start if you're interested in forming a creative co-op. Where do you actually begin? The instinct for a lot of people is to jump straight into incorporation, file the paperwork, get the legal structure in place, then figure out the rest later. But the way we see it is that's backwards. The legal stuff is the easy part. What's hard and what determines whether your co-op survives is the relational groundwork you do before any of that. These are the four stages that we see as cooperative studio development. And most people jump right into that stage two. And because they didn't do enough foundational work, they end up failing. So what is pre-formation work? It's where all the important work happens. Remember, have patience for the pace of trust. This process may take some time. You'll want to start with values. We mean actually doing a structured values alignment exercise together, not just assuming you're on the same page because you're all buds and you go way back. And then test your partnership with a project. This could be a game jam or a small commission, or even a structured project that you come up with yourselves that isn't just hanging out or co-working. Know your team and yourself. What are your skills, your interests, your dreams, your working styles, and your capacities and your boundaries? And then design your governance together. How will you handle making decisions, conflict, bringing in new members? And finally, start with financial transparency. What are people's actual needs? What are the financial realities everyone is working with? This is the what I was talking about, testing your partnership with a game jam or small commission. The idea is just making something together because it will tell you so much. Can you actually work together creatively? How do you actually handle disagreements and conflict? And if you can't collaborate on a tiny project like this, you definitely can't run a studio together. And it's better to find out now than after you've filed paperwork and combined your finances. The industry tells us to brute force our way through these situations, with the boss ultimately resolving the issue the way they want, probably guided by move fast and figure it out later. Speed is inherently extractive. Cooperative work requires something different. What Indigenous organizer Ruth Shivaya Kissen-Miller calls patience for the pace of trust. I like this Indigenous countermodel to the capitalist efficiency logic of move at the speed of trust from Stephen M.R. Covey's self-help book. Sustainability isn't necessarily going to come immediately or even quickly, but you can lay the groundwork that fits your intentions and your needs. So before we get to some resources, here's what we hope you take home. First, that structure shapes culture. You can't wish your way to equity. If you want people to have power, you have to build that into how you operate. Second, most co-ops and collaborative studios fail because of interpersonal and values conflicts, not because they ran out of money or couldn't make good work. And that's why pre-formation matters so much and why we focus on it at Baby Ghosts. Again, do the relational work before you file paperwork. And third, you don't need anyone's permission to do this. Mutual aid, community care, keeping each other well. We're just going to put some structure around what you already know. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Eileen to quickly go through some pitfalls.
Yes, I will actually kind of rush through the pitfalls a little bit so that we have time for questions, although I've been trying to answer some in the chat. Um, we've seen some of the things that have gone wrong. The good news is we have some things that you can watch for and you can avoid these pitfalls or catch them early. So the number one thing that takes down collaborative studios is when one person becomes the face or the voice or the visionary, the charmer, the boss. This is really common in creative industries because the media loves a solo genius. And because, as someone asked, people have a lot of individual tie to their creative work. We can counter this in our co-ops by rotating who does external facing work, so who gets featured in interviews, documenting everything so that knowledge isn't locked up in one person's brain, building in delegation early so the co-op can survive if someone steps back or burns out, and shadowing roles so that you learn from the people who maybe have more experience or who are louder, so on. The other is skipping the pre-formation work that Jennie was just talking about. Folks want to make art and they're often chasing project funding, so this rush is built into the system and it feels necessary to go fast, but it isn't. You don't want to get into a situation where you have assumed that you have shared values when you really don't. And I shared some tools for exercises you can do about figuring out what your values are as a team in the chat. The conflict so often arises when two people think that a value means a different thing. So like, what do you actually mean by transparency, etc.? I'm just going to keep moving on, actually. So the other is scaling too fast. We've talked about the like urgency thing and how that's what the industry thrives on. Adding in members to a co-op changes everything, and you need to really be like aware of that. It's great to start with a small team, really build a foundation, and not just bring people in really fast because you're like, oh, we gotta like meet this project goal. And then number 4 is perfectionism and urgency. This is, again, internalized from capitalism. Thank you so much, capitalism. It tells us that every deadline is life or death. It can be okay to slow down. Perfectionism often keeps you from starting, and we need to make some mistakes along the way to succeed. And then finally, the biggest, in my opinion, is conflict avoidance. The industry tells us that conflict is a problem to eliminate. Often a person is like not a culture fit, so they just get fired. This gets bogged down in paperwork. We need to talk about conflict from the beginning of forming a cooperative because conflict is always going to happen. It's better to have those systems in place ahead of time to know how you're going to deal with things, to have an external mediator handy that you know that you can work with if stuff arrives. The focus is on our relationships and not treating one another as disposable. So those are the pitfalls. We've covered everything that we need to cover. So let's just step back and reflect on all of this. What actually becomes possible when your structure matches your values? To recap, instead of moving fast and breaking things, we have patience for the pace of trust. Instead of urgency, we support each other. Instead of resolving conflict, conflict is information that we work with together. Instead of throwing workers off the boat, every member is invested in collective success. Instead of profit extraction, resources flow to contributors. And instead of having a single point of failure, knowledge doesn't leave when one person does. Okay, we've covered a lot. There are some resources here. These slides will be shared after the fact, so I'm not going to go through all of this. If you need funding, the cooperative CDP offers cooperative CDP offers $5,000 to $20,000 grants specifically for co-op development, and the CCIF does larger amounts if you're further along. We have this beautiful site, coop.love/tools, that has templates and wizards that we've developed. It's free and totally private. There's no sign up needed. You can build a budget, you can make an agreement. If you want to connect with us, we are building a membership community called Ghost Guild. Pre registration is open on our site. You can also book a call with us because we just love to talk about this stuff. Um, Building these alternatives is how we survive to keep creating. The systems we've inherited aren't, were never designed to save us. They're designed to extract value. And if you're doubting yourself, you're like, I can't do this, just know that the skills you've built surviving in hostile industries are business skills. Your community connections and the people you've supported and who've supported you are your real network. So let's build something better than what we've got with each other. So thank you. I know we haven't left a ton of time for questions, but we'll answer the ones we can, and we'll also answer them after the fact, and it can be sent out to you later. Um, we genuinely love hearing from folks, so are very happy to like have you reach out at any point. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking for a second.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Eileen. That was amazing. So we do have some questions in the chat. So maybe I'll start with one from the chat and then maybe we can open it up. And if somebody has a question here, they can just raise their hand, if that sounds okay. Okay, so let's go back here. So creative work is often experienced as personal, and the need for attribution indicates that many creators view their creations as extensions of themselves. How do creative co-ops handle this focus on identity and the construction of the self, which is common to creative people? How do you collectively share this ego during the planning of a creative project and in deciding who to involve and to what extent?
Jenny's got her thinking face on.
I have my thinking face. I feel like there was a lot in there, so I'm thinking about initially that is, you know, part of your desire to be in a cooperative is about making contributions without expecting necessarily like a profit or a large return or traditional ways of being credited or compensated or rewarded for your work. So you're joining a co-op to bring yourself into something that is bigger than yourself. And I think that what we see with the co-ops that we work with is that mindset is really pervasive. Folks really want to decouple that strong connection with their identity from their work and join it with what everyone else is doing. That doesn't mean, that they don't get that credit that they need or the other rewards that you need from doing this creative work. But in terms of like the construction of the self and tying your creative work to that, that's still there. It doesn't go away even if you leave the co-op. That is still, work that you've done. It's contribution that you've made. It's part of your portfolio. It's part of your credit. I know I keep going back to those things because they're so important in our industry in particular, and it might be different in others. But yeah, I feel like I only answered like 10% of that question, but maybe Eileen has a follow-up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, if we think of the industry as it has been, folks often also don't get like any credit for the work that they've done. Like if you're working in a traditional studio, you design a character, that becomes extremely successful, you don't get anything out of that. The company gets everything out of it. So it's not like this is a new problem, and the cooperative structure actually allows you to have shared ownership over it. So in some ways, you're actually kind of getting more ownership than what you think. Maybe we can go to the next question. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So we have kind of two, I'll kind of maybe put them together. So one is asking if you could speak to onboarding new members who might be tired of industry status quo, but might not be familiar with co-ops. So, for example, do you bring members on right away, or as employees first, or some other kind of working relationship that might allow for that relationship building that you said was so important, before they actually become a member? And then there was another question I thought was kind of related to that: is everyone a full-time member? Um, and whether there's been any backlash, especially if participants perceive the co-op as akin to unionization. Um, so backlash in terms of full or part-time members, if that exists. So how does someone become a member? How do you get that process started? And then does everyone have to be a full-time member? And is there backlash in terms of how much you work? I guess.
Mm. Yeah, I can start with the first question maybe. For bringing on new members, usually what folks do is have a probationary period where that person is maybe being paid as like a employee or a contractor, but they can also like join in on cooperative meetings and see if that's something that they're interested in, um, if that's like works for them, because some people are maybe not going to want to come in on that, some people are, but it's good to like have a period of like trying to work with each other, introducing them to the way that the studio works, before you start bringing them in as a full member. Jenny, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, I was going to actually go to the next part, just so we can get to more questions maybe. So the backfire, I'm not 100% sure if this is a question, but are you saying like some people are working full time and others are working part time, or there's a mix of contractors and employees? Is there tension? Yeah, that's what governance is for. And this is why we talk about onboarding very slowly and doing that education piece. If people don't understand what they're getting into, there's going to be conflict. And then I saw in the chat, or any other type of NDA backfire for part-time workers. Yes, we've seen people working for different companies, two different co-ops. And as long as you have a written agreements for these relationships, you're pretty protected, and those relationships are understood. That doesn't mean something might not go awry. And it goes back to, how are you managing conflict? Do you have a process in place before a crisis happens, before there is a backfire? That's something we talk about a lot. It's just doing those things before you run into problems.
Yeah, great answers. Amazing. Okay, does anyone have maybe one last question? You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself before we wrap up. Barat, I see. Oh, and Sherry, we'll get two in before we go. Anybody else, drop your questions in the chat, because we're going to send these to Jenny and Eileen, and then we'll send out a document after with their notes on it. They've been lovely enough to offer to do that for everyone, so not to worry. Okay, Brett, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. And Sherry, I mean, if you want to go first, I mean, just please go ahead. I mean, there's no hurry at all. I mean, yeah. So please go ahead, Sherry.
Um, I'm fine with either. I did post it in the chat too, but it's more on like onboarding and educating people outside of the co-op, like accountants and lawyers and those kinds of people. I've been really struggling with them understanding like I want to work with a credit union and I don't want to work with big publishers. And I know like it's ingrained in them. So I'm just wondering if there are any like resources out there to find more like-minded people in like those external services, or is it just going to take more time and we just have to do more work or a little bit of both or uh
It's I think it's an evolving thing right now. I mean, OCA might have some resources that they can provide. And we generally refer folks to their regional cooperative associations for those types of resources. But we are also building our own, but this requires work. It requires educating those professionals on cooperatives, and it can be slow going, and it's very different from what they're used to. But we've been lucky to work with accountants and lawyers that are willing and excited because we're working in video games and it's cool, and then we rope them into cooperatives. So it is a little bit of both. It's about reaching out to folks with those resources already, like those cooperative associations, and us collectively building those resources as well.
thank you.
Okay, and Bharat, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks a lot, Michelle. And just very sort of very similar to what no, Sherry mentioned, Jenny and Eileen. I mean, first of all, I mean, thanks a lot. Your presentation was really one of the most engaging ones I've ever heard. So thanks a lot for that. I mean, like, fantastically, delivered as well as, the slides. I think it was such a great package. So thanks a lot for that to both of you. My question is just about like as Sherry mentioned, in terms of like-minded people in say lawyers, who can with whom we can work with. Same about government in the sense that say government does a lot of things to promote say companies, right, capitalist companies. I mean, government has a lot of support in various ways that they promote. In terms of your say discussions with say public officials, policymakers, what has been the vibe that you have got in terms of like, do they have the awareness? If so, how supportive they have been? That is just the question that I have, Jenny and Erin.
Yeah, it's yes, the question is like how is government and policymakers, what are their views on cooperatives and do they understand?
Exactly.
So, 10 years ago, the arts councils, the federal funders like Canada Media Fund, they didn't want they thought co-ops were weird and they didn't want to give them any money. That has changed so much, starting with the arts councils recognizing video games are art, for one. I'm talking about games. They recognize video games are art, so the local, the provincial, and federal governments across Canada, fund video games. Then we got to slip in the cooperative stuff. And the Canada Media Fund now recognizes and will fund cooperatives. So part of what Baby Ghost is doing research and data collection and building cases for why cooperatives should be fundable, should be more fundable than traditional businesses. So it's we're babies, we're baby ghosts, and the associations across Canada have been doing this work for a long time, and I think it's all about us all collaborating and identifying what are the policies, what are the funds, what are who do we need to talk to start this education, and we recognize that it's slow going, but we do have a foothold.
I will also just add into that we've been doing some work speaking with Avi Lewis, who is running for the leader of NDP, about the value of cooperatives, and this is something that I am trying to get in to the convention in March. So maybe there's a future there as well. Who knows?